He married her. Then he never touched her again. For 18 months, Amara Brooks shared a penthouse, a last name, and a bed with the most dangerous man in New York. And he treated her like furniture. No explanation, no apology, just silence dressed up in designer clothes and public smiles. Then the piano teacher arrived. And Kang Jae-hyun, the man who had never feared anything in his life, learned what it felt like to be afraid of losing something he never allowed himself to have. This is the story of a woman who stopped waiting, a man who waited too long, and the moment everything between them finally broke open. If this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Follow the channel and stay until the very end. You will not want to miss what happens next. The morning Amara Brooks decided to stop waiting for her husband, it was raining. Not the dramatic kind of rain that announces itself with thunder and wind, and the kind of sky that looks like a bruise spreading across the horizon. Just gray, steady, indifferent rain. The kind that falls on New York in November like the city has simply given up pretending the season will ever change. It streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse in long, crooked lines, and turned the Manhattan skyline into a smear of light and wet concrete 42 floors below. She stood at the window in bare feet, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk, watching the rain because there was nothing else to watch. Jae-hyun had already left. He left before 6 most mornings, sometimes before 5, moving through the penthouse with the controlled quiet of a man who had spent years learning how not to disturb things. She rarely heard the elevator, rarely heard his voice before noon. Sometimes she only knew he'd been home at all because of the faint smell of his cologne near the kitchen, sandalwood and something colder underneath, something she had never been able to name, and the single rinsed coffee cup set upright in the drying rack beside the sink. One cup. Always one. Never two. 18 months of marriage, and she still made coffee for 2 every morning. She still poured the second cup and set it on the counter and told herself today would be different. Today he would come down the hallway with his jacket undone and his hair not yet combed, and he would sit across from her at the kitchen island, and they would talk the way people talked when they were actually married to each other. Not performing, not managing appearances, just talking. It hadn't happened yet. She set her cup in the sink beside his, watched the rain for another minute. Then she opened her laptop and typed 3 words into the search bar that she had typed and deleted 7 times over the previous 2 weeks. Piano lessons. Manhattan. It wasn't a dramatic decision. That was the thing nobody would ever understand about it. It wasn't spite, and it wasn't rebellion, and it wasn't some calculated move designed to make Jae-hyun notice her. She was 31 years old. She had a graduate degree in international finance that she was no longer using because her husband's security team had made it tactfully clear that her continued employment at a public firm created what they called exposure vectors. She had friends she could no longer see easily because those same friends required explanations she wasn't allowed to give. She had a penthouse with 11 rooms and a view of the entire city, and she had learned over the course of 18 months that space and silence were not the same thing as peace. She just wanted something that was hers. The search returned 14 results. She looked at all of them twice, the way she looked at everything now, carefully, reading between the lines for things that might not be safe. A habit she hadn't asked to develop but had developed anyway. The way you develop a habit of checking door locks when you've been told enough times that the world outside is more dangerous than it appears. She chose a name from the list. Elijah Monroe. Private instruction, all skill levels. Studio on the Upper West Side, 12 blocks from the building. His website was simple, a headshot, a bio, a rate schedule, a contact form. The headshot showed a man in his mid-30s with an open, direct expression, the kind of face that didn't appear to be performing anything for the camera. His bio said he had trained at a conservatory in Boston, had taught for 8 years, believed that music belonged to everyone and not just to people who had started young. She filled out the contact form, hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she went and got dressed and spent the next 4 hours doing absolutely nothing that mattered, which was how she spent most of her days now, and tried not to think about how long she had been disappearing by degrees inside this life she hadn't entirely chosen. She had chosen Jae-hyun. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself, because the version of events that lived in her own head sometimes got complicated by everything that had come after. She had met him 3 years ago at a finance conference in Seoul. She was there representing her firm. He was there as a legitimate face on a set of very illegitimate interests, and neither of them had pretended otherwise for very long. He was 41, lean and controlled, the kind of man who occupied space without appearing to take up room. He had dark eyes that processed everything without giving anything back, and he spoke to her that first evening like she was someone worth taking seriously, which at the time had felt rare enough to be remarkable. She knew what he was. Not the specifics. Those came later, and some of them she still didn't have, but the shape of it, the gravity of it. You didn't get to be Kang Jae-hyun without leaving a particular kind of shadow. She wasn't naive. She had grown up watching her own father navigate the gray edges of international finance, had learned early that the line between legal and criminal was often just a matter of paperwork and jurisdiction. She understood the world he moved in better than he might have expected. They had dated for 7 months. Carefully, always carefully, but genuinely. She had believed it then, and she still believed it now. He had been present in those months in a way that felt like something real. He had listened. He had pushed back when she said things that didn't hold up. He had taken her to a small restaurant in Brooklyn on their 4th meeting that had no Michelin stars and no visible security presence, and the best jerk chicken she had eaten outside of her grandmother's kitchen, and they had sat there for 3 hours talking about nothing that mattered, and she had thought, somewhere around the 2nd hour, that this man was actually capable of being known. He had proposed on a Tuesday in November in the kitchen of his apartment in Tribeca, without a ring and without a rehearsed speech, just standing there in his shirt sleeves with his hands in his pockets, saying that he wanted her in his life in a way that was permanent. She had said yes. She had meant it. The wedding was small by the standards of his world. 60 people, a private venue in the West Village. Nothing that made the social pages. She had worn a dress that was almost but not quite white, the color of heavy cream, and she had stood across from him and meant every word of what she said. The problem started that night. Or rather, the problem revealed itself that night. She had come to think of it that way, as a revelation rather than a beginning, because she didn't believe it had started then. She believed it had been present already, underneath, something Jae-hyun had been managing so precisely for so long that even he might not have recognized it as the thing it was. He had been gentle about it, careful. That was the word she kept coming back to. Careful, like a man handling something that might break. Except she was the thing, and she wasn't sure whether he was afraid of breaking her or of being broken himself. He had held her that first night. His arms had been real. His presence had been real. The warmth of him had been real. But when she had moved towards something more than holding, he had gone still in a way that wasn't physical reluctance. It was something older and more deliberate than that. Not tonight, he had said, quietly, against her hair. She had waited. She had told herself it was nerves or exhaustion or the weight of a particular day. She had waited the next night, and the night after that, and the week after that. She had waited with patience that she was increasingly aware was costing her something she couldn't fully name. Some baseline of self she was slowly spending down without any accounting of where it was going. He never explained. She stopped asking after the 3rd month because asking had stopped producing anything except the kind of silence that made her feel worse than the original question. He wasn't cold with her. That was the maddening part of it, the part that made her second-guess her own reading of the situation. He was attentive in every way except the way that might have told her something true about where she stood. He remembered details. He asked about her days with what appeared to be genuine interest. On the rare evenings they were both home, he sat near her. Not across the room, not ostentatiously distant, just near, in the specific way of a man who wanted proximity without contact, who wanted warmth without exposure. She had come to think of it as his particular genius for managing distance, making it look like presence, making the absence feel almost like a choice she had made herself. Elijah Monroe responded to her contact form within 2 hours. His email was direct and practical, available times, location, what to expect from a first session, a note that absolute beginners were welcome, and that there was no such thing as a point in life at which music was no longer accessible. She read it 3 times, which was 2 times more than it required, then wrote back and confirmed a Thursday slot at 11 in the morning. She told Jae-hyun over dinner that evening, or what passed for dinner, They rarely ate at the same time unless they had somewhere to be, so it was more accurately described as the hour between 7 and 8 when they were both in the penthouse and nominally in the same room. He was working at the kitchen island, papers spread across the marble in a pattern that looked like chaos but probably wasn't. Jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. She sat at the island with a glass of water and told him she had signed up for piano lessons. He looked up from the papers. Not immediately. There was the briefest interval, maybe 2 seconds, in which he continued reading whatever was in front of him before he registered that she had spoken. Then he looked up, and his expression was the careful neutral she had learned to read as the face he used when he was actually thinking rather than when he was simply being unreachable. "Piano," he said. "Piano. You've never played. That's why they're called lessons." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of a smile and then wasn't. He looked back at the papers, then back at her. "Where?" "Upper West Side, 12 blocks. I'll have Sue inform security." "I don't need a detail for a piano lesson, Jae-hyun. You'll have one anyway." He said it the way he said most things, not as a demand, not with heat, just as a fact that had already been decided in some layer of reality she didn't have full access to. He picked up his pen. "Who's the instructor?" She told him. He wrote the name down without any visible reaction, which meant either it meant nothing to him or he was very good at his face, and she had long since stopped being able to tell the difference. "Fine," he said. "Thank you for your blessing," she said. The sarcasm landed somewhere in the space between them, and he absorbed it without flinching, which was its own specific kind of response. She took her water glass and went to the other end of the penthouse, and lay on the bed fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling until she fell asleep sometime after midnight. The first lesson was unremarkable in the way that first lessons always are. All logistics and introduction, the mechanics of posture and hand position, and the layout of the keyboard. Elijah Monroe was, in person, much what his headshot had suggested. Direct, unhurried, genuinely interested in teaching without being performatively enthusiastic about it. He was black, medium height, with the kind of physical stillness that reminded her of musicians she had heard described as economical. No wasted movement, no unnecessary noise. He spoke clearly and without condescension, and when she played something wrong, which she did constantly in those first 40 minutes, he corrected her without framing it as failure. The security man Sue had assigned, a quiet Korean man named Park, who wore civilian clothes and sat in a coffee shop across the street, was visible from the studio window if she looked for him. She tried not to look for him. What she hadn't expected was how much she needed the hour. Not the piano specifically, though that would come. Just the hour. An hour in a room that had nothing to do with Jae-hyun's world, with a person who knew nothing about it, doing something that produced noise and occasionally something approaching music and required nothing from her except attention. She drove home afterward in the car that Sue had arranged, feeling lighter than she had in months, and she recognized the lightness immediately for what it was, which was simply the sensation of having been somewhere that belonged to her. She booked the following Thursday before she left the studio. By the 6th lesson, she could play a simple melody with both hands in rough coordination. By the 8th, she had started laughing in the studio, at her own mistakes, at the particular indignity of a scale that refused to flow, at the gap between what she heard in her head and what came out of her fingers. It was not the polished, social laughter she produced at events and gatherings. It was the other kind, the kind that surprised you, the kind you couldn't entirely control. Elijah noticed. Not in a way that overstepped anything. He was scrupulously professional, always, and she was aware of it and grateful for it. But there was a moment during the 9th lesson when she landed a difficult passage correctly for the first time and laughed with a genuineness that made her cover her mouth like it had caught her off guard. And he looked at her and said simply, "There you are." She had driven home with those 3 words sitting in her chest like something warm that hadn't been there before. She didn't tell Jae-hyun about it. She didn't tell him much about the lessons anymore. She had mentioned a few early milestones and received polite, appropriately minimal responses. And she had eventually stopped mentioning them at all. The lessons were hers. That was the whole point. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't know until much later, was that Jae-hyun had started paying attention. Okay, not because he had asked for reports. He hadn't. or so she would eventually learn. The reports came through anyway, because they always did. Because the men around him operated by a logic of total information. Because knowing everything about everything was the baseline of survival in the world Jae-hyun had built. Park filed his observations the same way he filed observations about everything. Routine, thorough, without editorial judgment. Jae-hyun read them the same way he read everything, except he didn't. He read them twice. He read them at his desk in the study with the door closed, the second time slowly, with the kind of attention he generally reserved for threat assessments and contract details. And when he finished the second reading, he sat back in his chair and stared at the middle distance for a long time, doing nothing, which was something Jae-hyun almost never did. The report said, she arrives on time. 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. Monroe maintains professional distance. She appears relaxed. She laughed during today's session. 3 times. He read that sentence 4 times. 3 times. He put the report down, picked it up again, set it face down on the desk. He had known, on some intellectual level, that the distance between them had cost her something. He wasn't incapable of reading another person's unhappiness. He had simply learned, over many years and for reasons that had made sense in every context except this one, to treat his own emotional responses as variables to be managed rather than facts to be acknowledged. He had kept distance from Amara, not because she meant nothing to him, but because she meant too much. And in his world, too much meaning in one direction was a structural vulnerability, a point of pressure an enemy could find and use. He had watched men he respected destroyed by exactly this kind of exposure, watched organizations crack at the exact joint where something personal had been allowed to matter. He had told himself the distance was protection. He had told himself she was safer this way. Unknown, or at least unknowable, or at least not clearly and visibly loved, which in his world translated to not being a target. A wife who appeared to be a social arrangement rather than a genuine attachment was a wife who was structurally less useful to his enemies as leverage. He had told himself all of this so many times that he had almost stopped hearing it as a choice and started hearing it as simply the truth about how things were. The report. 3 times. She laughed 3 times. He hadn't heard her laugh like that in the penthouse. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard her laugh at all. There were social laughs, event laughs, the particular controlled warmth she deployed at dinners and gatherings. But that wasn't what Park's report was describing. Park's report was describing something unguarded, something that came out before she could stop it. He wasn't going to examine what he felt reading that. He wasn't going to name it. He filed the report in the drawer with the others and went back to work and spent the next 2 hours being extremely focused on things that were not Amara laughing in a piano studio 12 blocks north. The dinner where things began to shift happened on a Wednesday evening in February, 3 weeks after the 9th lesson, 6 weeks before anything would finally come apart. They had an event, a quarterly dinner with a group of legitimate business associates, whose function was partly social and partly the maintenance of the legal scaffolding around Jae-hyun's various interests. 12 people at a restaurant in Midtown that was elegant without being ostentatious, the kind of place where the food was excellent and the service was invisible and nobody asked questions about anything. Amara dressed carefully, the way she always dressed for these evenings, something that signaled appropriate wealth without ostentation, that said wife without saying decoration, that kept her presence useful without making her the focus of anyone's attention for too long. She had done this enough times that it required almost no thought. She was good at it, which she supposed said something about her. Jae-hyun met her in the elevator lobby at 7:15. He was in a dark suit, gray tie, the controlled presentation he wore like a second skin. He looked at her for a beat longer than he usually did. She noticed and made herself not react to it. In the car, something unusual happened. "How are the lessons going?" he said. Not looking at her schwa, he rarely looked at her directly in close spaces, another pattern she had catalogued without fully understanding, but the question was unambiguous. She looked at the passing streetlights. Well meaning you're progressing, or well meaning you're enjoying it? Both, she said. Then, why do you ask? A pause. The car moved through the midtown traffic with the particular efficiency of a driver who knew how to navigate by a route that wasn't accidental. "I'm interested in what you're doing," he said. "Since when?" She hadn't meant for that to come out as sharp as it did. Or maybe she had. She was increasingly uncertain about the line between what she meant to say and what came out when her guard was down. He absorbed it, as he absorbed most things. "It's a fair question," he said. "It's a real question," she said. "I want a real answer." He was quiet for a moment. The car turned north on 6th Avenue. "I'm aware I haven't been—" He stopped, started again. "I know the arrangement hasn't been what you expected." "The arrangement," she repeated. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The marriage." "Right. The marriage." She kept her voice even. She had learned that even was more effective than anything else, that volatility gave him something to manage rather than something to answer. "And you're asking about my piano lessons because I wanted to know how you are." "Jae-hyun." She said his name slowly, like she was setting it down carefully on a surface. "You've had a man sitting in the coffee shop across from the studio for 2 months. You know exactly how I am." The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It had more weight to it. Something that might have been discomfort, if discomfort was something Kang Jae-hyun was capable of. "That's for your safety," he said. "Not surveillance." "I know the difference," she said, "but I also know that the reports go somewhere." She let that sit there. Let him decide what to do with it. They arrived at the restaurant 2 minutes later, and the moment closed over like water over a stone, smooth and complete, and giving no indication of what was underneath. But she had seen his face in the brief second between her words and the car stopping, and she had recognized for the first time in 18 months that Kang Jae-hyun was not as completely in control of himself as he wanted her to believe. She started paying attention differently after that. She had always watched him. It was impossible not to. Living with someone whose surface was that controlled, you developed a habit of reading the small things because the small things were all you were given. But she had been watching passively, the way you watch weather from inside a building. Now she watched with something more purposeful. She watched for breaks in the pattern. They happened, small ones, infrequent, but they happened. The Thursday after the dinner, she came home from her lesson in a particularly good mood. Elijah had introduced her to a piece she had known only as background music her whole life, and discovering that she could produce even a rough version of it with her own hands had given her a kind of quiet joy she hadn't anticipated. She came through the penthouse door with her coat still on and made a comment to no one in particular about the particular miracle of hands that could learn things, and Jae-hyun, who was in the living room with a phone pressed to his ear, and who she had assumed was deep in whatever conversation required him to stand facing the window with that particular set to his spine, turned around. He didn't hang up the phone, but he looked at her for a full 5 seconds in a way that wasn't the usual managed assessment. Something slightly undone about it. Something that didn't quite get composed before she caught it. He turned back to the window. She hung up her coat and went to make tea and stood in the kitchen with her back to the living room thinking about the 5 seconds until the kettle boiled. Thursdays later, she came home later than usual. She and Elijah had gone slightly over on time because she had been so close to getting a particular passage right that neither of them had wanted to stop. And Jae-hyun was in the kitchen when she came in. He was not there at 2:30 in the afternoon as a rule. He was there, with no obvious reason to be there, in his work clothes, making coffee he apparently didn't drink because the cup sat full and cooling on the counter. "You're late," he said, flatly. No accusation in it, just a statement that he had noticed. "I lost track of time," she said. He looked at her, something tight around his eyes. "Park noted you stayed 30 minutes past the scheduled end." And nothing. He stopped, picked up the coffee cup, set it down. "Nothing." She watched him for a moment. The tight thing around his eyes wasn't anger. She was fairly certain it wasn't anger. "Jae-hyun," she said. "It's fine," he said. He picked up a folder from the counter and left the kitchen, and she stood where she was for a long moment, listening to his footsteps move down the corridor toward the study. She thought, he was waiting. The thought was so significant that it made her slightly unsteady on her feet, like the floor had shifted 2 degrees under her. She made herself not chase it too hard. She was not going to build a whole structure on one data point. She was not going to do that to herself again. But she did not think it either. In the 3rd week of March, Amara agreed to participate in a small, informal recital that Elijah organized for his intermediate students. It was not a public event. It was a private gathering of maybe 15 people, mostly family members of the other students, held in a slightly larger studio space 2 blocks from the regular one, an hour on a Saturday afternoon. Elijah had pitched it as a low-stakes opportunity to play in front of other people, which he had explained was a different kind of learning from playing alone, and Amara had said yes before fully thinking through the implications. The implications were Jae-hyun would know. Not because she told him, she considered telling him and then didn't, primarily because she didn't want the conversation about security that would follow. The careful management of a thing that she needed to remain uncomplicated. The implications were that Park would be there, or someone like Park, and that Jae-hyun would have a report of an event involving Amara and the piano teacher in a non-studio setting with other people present, and she was increasingly aware that this information might land differently than a routine Thursday lesson. She went anyway. She wore a dress that was not her event dress. It was an ordinary dark green dress, one she had bought for herself without consulting anyone, bought because she liked it. And she sat in a row of folding chairs with 4 other students ranging in age from 16 to 60 and played a 90-second simplified version of a piece she had been working on for 3 weeks. She made 2 mistakes. She didn't stop playing. She finished the piece and sat back on the bench and exhaled, and several people clapped, and Elijah, from the back of the room, gave her a nod that meant she had done what she came to do. Afterward, she stood with a cup of terrible coffee talking to a woman named Dorothy, who was 63 and learning piano because her grandchildren had asked her to, and who had the most complete and unguarded happiness on her face of anyone Amara had been in a room with in years. She talked to Dorothy for 20 minutes about music and grandchildren and New York in the spring, and felt, in that 20 minutes, entirely like a person. She was still thinking about Dorothy when she came home that evening. Jae-hyun was in the living room. He didn't look up from what he was reading, but his attention was not on the page. She had learned his tells well enough now to know that. He was aware of her with every part of himself while performing the opposite, and the effort of the performance was just barely visible in the stillness of his hands on the document he wasn't reading. "There was a recital today," she said. She wasn't going to pretend. She was done pretending in this apartment. He looked up. "I know." "Okay." "You didn't tell me." "No." The word sat there. He held it. "Why?" "Because I didn't want the conversation we would have had if I told you beforehand." She was still standing in her coat, her bag over her shoulder. "We would have had a conversation about security and exposure vectors, and I would have ended up not going or going with 3 people in the room who weren't there to listen to piano music. And I needed to go, and I needed it to just be what it was." He was very still. "And what was it?" "It was a Saturday afternoon in a room with 15 people listening to beginners play piano." She let that land. "It was one of the better hours I've had in this city in a year and a half. That's what it was." Something crossed his face. She caught it and couldn't quite name it. Not anger, not hurt exactly. Something with both in it and something else underneath that she was afraid to look at too directly. "You were safe," he said. His voice was careful. "I know I was safe." She set her bag on the chair. "Jae-hyun, I know there was someone in that room who wasn't there for the piano. I'm not naive about the world you operate in. I've never been naive about it." She looked at him. "But there's a difference between being protected and being managed. And I've been managed inside this apartment for 18 months while calling it a marriage. And I'm tired." The silence after that was different from the other silences. Longer, heavier. He didn't look away from her, which was itself unusual. He looked at her straight on, with something unguarded in it, and she stood her ground and looked back. "Amara," he said, and then nothing. Just her name, like he had said it to test whether it still worked the same way. "I'm not angry at you," she said. It's not about being angry. I'm just telling you what's true." "I know," he said. "I don't think you do." He was quiet for a long time, then, "The lessons are important to you." "Yes." "Monroe." He said the name in a particular register that she couldn't quite categorize, and she watched his face for a moment, and then she understood something she hadn't understood before. Not completely, not with full certainty, but enough. "He's my piano teacher," she said, evenly. "I know what he is." "Do you?" His jaw moved. His hands, resting on the document, were very still. "He makes you laugh," he said. The sentence came out like something extracted rather than offered, like a splinter coming out of skin. She was quiet for a moment. "He teaches well," she said. "I learn things in that room. I feel like myself in that room. And yes, sometimes I laugh in that room. And that is the complete and entire nature of what happens in that room." He held her gaze. "What I feel," she said slowly and carefully, "for my piano teacher is gratitude. That is all it is, and all it has ever been. What I feel," she stopped, started again. "What I feel about other matters is a separate question, and it is not one I'm going to answer tonight in the front hallway with my coat still on." She picked up her bag and walked down the corridor to the bedroom, and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of her own breathing, feeling something that might have been the beginning of something, or might have been the end of her patience, and not yet knowing which. Behind her, in the living room, Kang Jae-hyun sat with the document in his hands and didn't read a single word for 40 minutes. The call from Seoul came on a Thursday. Not the Thursday of a lesson. A different Thursday, the last week of March. The kind of gray sky day that couldn't decide whether to rain or simply stay overcast until it became dark. Amara was in the kitchen with tea and a book she hadn't been fully present in for 3 chapters when she heard Jae-hyun's voice change in the study. She had learned his phone voices the way you learn a building's sounds. The difference between the footstep that means the pipe needs attention and the one that means something in the structure has shifted. His professional voice was smooth and measured and revealed nothing. His personal voice, the one he used with the very few people who existed in something approaching an inner circle, was slightly flatter, more direct, stripped of the social management. The voice she heard now was neither. It was the voice of a man receiving information he didn't want and processing it in real time, and even through 2 closed doors it made something in her stomach tighten. She didn't move. She sat with the tea going cold and waited. When he came out of the study 12 minutes later, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. She had seen controlled concern. She had seen the studied neutrality of a man who never wanted to show cards. She had seen the rare fractional softness he permitted himself in private. This was different. This was a man who had been frightened and who was managing it hard and who was not entirely succeeding. "Jae-hyun," she set the book down. "What happened?" He crossed the kitchen. He sat across from her at the island, something he almost never did. The geography of it deliberately parallel, choosing to be at her level rather than standing above the conversation. And he put both hands flat on the counter in front of him like he was steadying something. "Someone has been watching you," he said. The words were simple. She heard them clearly. She set the teacup down very carefully. "Watching me how?" she said. "Photographs. From the studio. From the recital." His voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't quite. "They were sent to a contact in Seoul, as a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind that says they know what matters." He looked at her. "The kind that says they can reach it." She held very still. The rain outside, it had decided to rain after all, was audible against the windows. She was thinking several things at once and sorting them into order. "Who sent them?" "A faction I've been in conflict with for 8 months. Based in Seoul, operational in 3 cities. They've been building leverage, waiting for an angle. And I'm the angle." He looked at something past her left shoulder. "You were never supposed to be." "But I am." He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. She looked at his hands flat on the counter, at the deliberate stillness of them. She thought about 18 months of distance and the reasons she had been given and the reasons she had eventually stopped asking and the logic of all of it. The protection, the safety, the structural invisibility of a marriage that didn't look like love. She thought about all of that and what it had and hadn't protected. "They were watching the lessons," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "We don't know yet. At least 6 weeks." 6 weeks. 12 lessons. Every Thursday, the coffee shop, the quiet street, the small studio with its upright piano and its natural light and the hour that had been hers. She felt something shift inside her. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. Something harder than fear. Something that had been building for a while and had finally found its shape. So the distance didn't protect me, she said, his hands pressed flat. Amara, the 18 months of keeping everything at arm's length, the one rinsed coffee cup, the arrangement. She said the last word precisely. It didn't protect me. They found me anyway. I know. Say that again. He looked at her directly. I know. She nodded slowly. Picked up the teacup. Put it back down without drinking from it. What happens now? I handle it. And me. You'll have increased Jae-hyun. His name, her voice, the kitchen, the rain. What happens to me? He was quiet for a long moment. She watched his face move through something, watched him arrive somewhere. I don't know yet, he said. Quietly. Honestly. The honesty of it was so uncharacteristic that it landed harder than an answer would have. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the rain on the glass for a moment, and then she said without turning around, You need to decide something, Jae-hyun. Not about strategy, not about security protocols. Something real. A breath. You need to decide whether this is a marriage or it isn't, and you need to do that before anyone else makes that decision for you. She left him in the kitchen and went to the bedroom, and this time she didn't close the door. She waited. For the first time in 18 months, she left the door open, and she didn't know whether what she was waiting for was an answer or a footstep in the hall, or simply the moment when everything between them would finally stop pretending to be something other than what it was. The rain came down against the windows. The hallway was quiet. The door was open. She waited. He didn't come. Not that night. Not while the rain was still hitting the windows and the hallway stayed quiet, and the open door meant nothing except that she had made a gesture into a void. She lay on top of the covers in her clothes and listened to the penthouse breathe, the low hum of the climate system, the distant sound of the city 42 floors below, and once, around 11, the soft sound of footsteps that paused outside her door for long enough that she held her breath, and then continued past toward the study. She let the breath out slowly. She stared at the ceiling for another hour, and then she got up and changed and turned off the light and lay in the dark and eventually slept the shallow, easily broken sleep of someone waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. In the morning, the second coffee cup was on the counter again, the way it always was, and she stood looking at it for a long moment before she poured it down the drain. The next 4 days had a specific quality to them that she recognized but couldn't immediately name. It came to her on the third day. They felt like the days before a storm that everyone can feel, but nobody will acknowledge. The pressure was real. It was in the air of every room, in the way Jae-hyun moved through the penthouse with slightly less of his usual precision, in the way he looked at her sometimes when he didn't think she was paying attention, quickly, sharply, like checking a wound. She was paying attention. She was always paying attention now. He had tightened security without discussing it with her. She knew this because Park had been replaced, or supplemented, by 2 additional men she didn't recognize, one of whom had taken up a position in the lobby of the building, and because Sue had appeared at the penthouse door on the Friday morning with a new briefing about protocols that she listened to with a patience she didn't entirely feel and agreed to with a compliance she knew Jae-hyun would read as cooperation and that she intended as temporary. She hadn't gone to Thursday's lesson. Jae-hyun hadn't told her not to. He hadn't said anything direct about the lessons at all, which was its own kind of instruction, and she had sat with that silence on Thursday morning and made a decision based not on fear, but on something more complicated, a recognition that she was operating inside a situation that had shifted and that she needed more information before she knew how to move. She texted Elijah to postpone. He responded within minutes. No problem. Hope everything's okay. She stared at the message for a moment, then typed back. Fine, just scheduling. Next week. She set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and didn't pick it up again for 2 hours. On Saturday evening, they had to go out. It was a commitment that had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. A dinner hosted by one of Jae-hyun's legitimate business partners, a man named David Weston, who ran a private equity firm in Midtown, and who was, as far as Amara had ever been able to determine, entirely unaware of the full nature of what he was partnered with. The dinner was at Weston's townhouse on the Upper East Side. 12 guests. The kind of evening that required performance. She was dressed before Jae-hyun came to find her. She was sitting at the vanity doing something unnecessary to her hair because her hair was already finished and she needed something to do with her hands. And when he appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, she met his eyes in the mirror and held them. He was in a charcoal suit. He looked the way he always looked for these evenings, assembled, contained, the particular authority of a man who occupied every room he entered as though the room had been waiting for him. She was aware, not for the first time and not without a complicated mixture of feelings, that he was an objectively striking man. The bones of his face, the controlled stillness of him, the dark eyes that processed everything. She was also aware that she was angry at him and that the anger was specific and earned and not going anywhere. "Ready," she said, not a question. "When you are." He paused. "You look—" Another pause. He made a small gesture with his hand that didn't resolve into anything. "Thank you," she said flatly, and stood up. The car downtown was silent in the way that their silences had shifted. Not the ordinary silence of two people who had run out of things to say. Not even the managed silence of the previous months. This was pressurized. She could feel him thinking beside her, and she made no effort to ease it. "I need you to know," he said, about halfway there, "that what's happening is being handled." What's being handled, specifically? The party's responsible for the surveillance, and it will be resolved within the week. She looked out the window at the Upper East Side sliding past in the dark. What does resolved mean in this context? A beat. It means they'll understand clearly that certain things are not available to them. Certain things meaning me. Yes. She didn't say anything to that for a moment, then, and what about next time, the time after that? "Amara, I'm asking a real question, not a rhetorical one." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "Is this something that gets resolved once, or is this the nature of the situation I'm living in?" His jaw moved. "It's managed risk. It changes over time." "That's not an answer." "It's the accurate one." She turned back to the window. "Then I need to think about whether accurate is enough." The silence after that had a different quality. She felt him register the sentence, felt, in the slight change in the way he was sitting, that it had landed somewhere real. They arrived at Weston's townhouse. The car stopped. Neither of them moved for a moment. "We'll talk," he said. "When we're home." "Yes," she said, "we will." She opened the door and got out and didn't wait for him, and she heard behind her the sound of him following. The dinner was the kind of social performance that Amara had become expert at, fluid, warm, appropriately present without being the center of anything, asking questions and listening to answers with the focused attention that made people feel that they were the most interesting person in the room. She had been good at this before Jae-hyun, had used it professionally, but in her professional context, it had felt like a tool. Here, it felt like camouflage. Jae-hyun worked the room differently. He didn't perform warmth, had never tried to. His particular social authority came from a quality of attention that read as intensity rather than charm, the way he engaged with whoever was in front of him as though they were the only problem worth solving. She had watched him do this for 18 months. She understood now that it was a version of the same control she resented at home, the complete management of what he revealed, extended to every room. She was standing near the fireplace with a glass of wine she was drinking slowly, talking to Weston's wife about something she was not fully tracking, when she became aware that Jae-hyun was watching her. Not the quick checks she had noticed at home. This was different. This was sustained. She was across the room from him, and he was in the middle of a conversation with two other men, and he wasn't looking at the other men. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has run out of road. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Weston's wife and continued the conversation about nothing. Her heart was doing something she was not going to analyze in the middle of a dinner party. They were home before 11. She had her coat off before the elevator reached their floor, and she set it on the chair in the hallway and kept moving through the penthouse to the kitchen, because she needed to be doing something with her hands. She ran water, got a glass, drank it standing at the sink, looking at the dark window and the city lights behind it. Jae-hyun followed her. He didn't say anything immediately. She heard him behind her, heard him stop, heard the specific quality of his stillness, which was different from ordinary stillness. "You want to leave?" he said. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, jacket still on, hands at his sides. His face was doing the thing it did when he wasn't fully controlling it. Not open, not exactly, but the control was visibly effortful. I didn't say that, she said. You implied it, in the car. I said I needed to think about whether accurate was enough. That's not the same thing as leaving. What does it mean then? She set the glass on the counter. It means I'm a person, Jaehyun, not a position, not a vulnerability you're managing. She kept her voice level. I've spent 18 months in this marriage trying to figure out what the rules were. Why you were here and also not here. Why I was present to you in some ways and completely unreachable in others. And I told myself there were reasons, that the world you're in had requirements, that I had agreed to something and I should live inside what I agreed to. You did agree. I agreed to marry you. I didn't agree to be a piece of furniture that you occasionally look at from across the room. The sentence came out harder than she intended. She didn't walk it back. I didn't agree to be managed. I didn't agree to be kept at precisely the distance that was convenient for your particular brand of emotional self-protection and have that called keeping me safe. The silence was sharp. His hands were very still at his sides. Emotional self-protection, he repeated. Yes. You think I kept distance from you because I was afraid. I think you kept distance from me because you decided what I needed without asking me. Because you built a logic around it that let you call it protection. And I think the real reason, she stopped, pushed through it. The real reason and the protection reason are probably both true at once. I think you were afraid. And I think you dressed it up in strategy because that's the only language you trust. He didn't move for a long moment. Something was happening in his face that she couldn't fully read. Too much in it, moving too fast. You don't know, he said, quietly. What it's like to watch someone become important to you and understand exactly what that means. In my world, what it costs. Then tell me. Tell me now. Not as a deflection, not as a reason we can't be closer. Tell me. It means you become the target. The words came out flat and final. It means everyone who wants to hurt me has a direct line to the worst thing they could do. It means I spend the rest of my life watching every room you walk into for the thing that's going to happen because I wasn't careful enough. His voice was controlled, but the thing underneath it wasn't. I have watched men I respected lose people. I have watched what that does. I decided a long time ago it would never be me, that I would never let something matter enough to be used. And then you married me anyway. The sentence stopped him cold. She held it. You married me anyway, Jaehyun. So the decision was already made. The vulnerability already existed. All the distance did was make sure we were both suffering through it alone. He stood in the doorway with the kitchen light behind her and said nothing. They found me anyway, she said. Whoever sent those photographs, they already knew. So the protection, she shook her head. Whatever it was protecting, it wasn't me. Something broke in his face, not dramatically, not the way things broke in films with visible collapse and immediate revelation. It was quieter than that. Something that had been held at a very specific tension for a very long time simply went slack. And the difference was visible if you knew how to look. She knew how to look. Amara. Her name. Just her name, the way he'd said it the other night. But now with something else in it. Something stripped of management, stripped of the careful distance, a frequency she hadn't heard from him before. I'm not asking you to choose between me and your world, she said. Quietly, directly. I know what your world is. I knew before I married you. I'm asking you to stop choosing between me and yourself. Stop deciding that wanting me is something you have to punish yourself for. A breath. I'm here. I've been here for 18 months. I never stopped being here. He crossed the kitchen, not slowly, not with hesitation. He crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of her, and his hand came up, and she thought for a moment, her breath caught on it, that he was going to touch her face. His hand stopped just short, hovering near her jaw, and she could feel the warmth of it from an inch away. If I start, he said, very low. If I let this, I don't know how to do this partially. You need to understand that. I don't have a partial setting. I know, she said. It would change the calculus of everything, every threat, every... Jae-hyun. She looked at him directly. Touch my face or don't, but stop explaining it. His hand closed the inch. His palm against her jaw was warm and careful, and she felt him exhale. Actually exhale, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying too long. And her eyes closed for just a moment. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then his phone went off. The sound of it was specific. Not his regular ringtone, a different one. The code she had learned over 18 months meant something operational, something that could not wait. He stepped back. His hand left her face. He pulled the phone from his pocket and looked at the screen, and the thing that had been in his face a moment ago shut down with the speed of a door closing against wind. I have to take this, he said. She said nothing. He stepped out of his kitchen. She heard his voice shift into the operational register, clipped and precise, and then the study door closed. She stood in the kitchen with her palm pressed to her own jaw where his hand had been. The warmth faded in about 30 seconds. She didn't sleep. She lay in the bedroom and listened to the muffled sound of his voice in the study until it stopped sometime after 1, and then she listened to the silence, and then she heard footsteps in the hall and the pause outside her door, and this time she said his name. Jae-hyun. The pause stretched. Then the door opened. He stood in the frame, jacket off now, shirt open at the collar. He looked exhausted in a way he didn't usually permit himself to look. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe and looked at her in the dark room and didn't say anything. What was the call? She said. A long pause. The envelope arrived. She sat up. What envelope? A photograph, left at the front desk downstairs. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing underneath. You, at the recital, seated at the piano. His jaw moved. And a note. What did the note say? He was quiet for a moment that was almost too long. Then, choose carefully. The room was very quiet. The city existed 42 floors below them, indifferent. She looked at him in the doorframe, his exhaustion, the controlled fear underneath his stillness, the whole long architecture of a man who had spent his entire life being afraid of exactly this moment. And she felt something settle inside her. Not calm exactly, something more like clarity. The particular clarity of a person who has run out of anything to pretend. Come in, she said, or don't. But stop standing in doorways. He looked at her for a moment, then he pushed off the frame and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Not close, not with any of the touching that had almost happened in the kitchen, just sat, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. The exhaustion on him was total. The performance was completely gone. She looked at his profile in the dark, at the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, and the hands that were clasped between his knees, not for composure, but because he didn't know what else to do with them. Jae-hyun, she said. He looked at her. You were never afraid of losing power, she said. She said it slowly, like she was setting each word down in the exact right place. You were afraid of needing someone. He held her gaze, didn't deflect, didn't manage, just held it, and let her see what was in his face. And what was in his face was the unguarded truth of a man who had just been correctly and completely known by another person for the first time in a very long time. Yes, he said. One word. Flat. Entirely honest. She held that word in the space between them. Then stop standing on the line, she said. He looked at her for a long, unmoving moment. And then, slowly, without the phone and without the strategy and without the architecture of managed distance he had spent years building, he reached out. His hand reached her face again. Both hands this time. Cupping her jaw the way you hold something you've been afraid to touch for so long that the touching itself feels like a risk, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. Not weakness, something older than weakness, the particular frequency of a man making a choice that undoes years of other choices. And she reached up and put her hands over his and held them there. He pressed his forehead to hers. They stayed like that for a long time, not moving, not speaking. The city below them and the dark room and the photograph downstairs and some security envelope and all the machinery of threat and consequence that surrounded them like weather. And inside all of that, just this. His forehead against hers, her hands over his, both of them breathing. It was the most honest thing that had happened in that penthouse in 18 months. She woke at 5:40 to an empty bed. Not the gradual empty of a person who had slipped out quietly. She had slept lightly enough that she would have felt him go, but she had slept, which was itself something she hadn't expected, and the place where he had eventually lain down beside her still held the slight warmth of recent absence. She lay still for a moment, taking stock of herself. The room was pre-dawn gray. The city outside existed in its early, quieter register. She got up, found him in the study. He was on the phone, not the operational ringtone call, something else, his voice lower and faster than she had heard it before. And when she appeared in the doorway, he looked at her briefly with an expression that had gone back to fully controlled, which meant he had been up long enough to reassemble himself and held up one finger. She leaned against the doorframe and waited. The call ended. He set the phone on the desk. "How long have you been up?" she said. 2 hours. The photograph. Among other things. He leaned back in the chair and looked at her, and the control was complete, but she was better at reading underneath it now. "We've identified the channel it came through, working on the source." "How long?" "Days, maybe less." She nodded, looked around the study. The papers, the multiple phones, the laptop with its cascade of screens. The infrastructure of a life she had agreed to and never fully seen from the inside. "I want to know things," she said. "Going forward. Not everything. I understand there are things I can't know. But I want to be told when something affects me directly." He studied her for a moment. "That will be most things." "I know." "You're sure that's what you want?" "I'm sure I don't want to be managed," she said. "I've been specific about that." Something that was almost a smile moved through his expression and didn't quite make it to his face. He nodded once, slowly, in a way that meant agreement that was real rather than social. "All right," he said. She pushed off the doorframe. "Come to bed for 2 hours. You'll think more clearly." He looked at her for a long beat, then he closed the laptop. He slept. She didn't entirely. She lay beside him in the gray morning and listened to his breathing even out and thought about the photograph and the note and the specific word carefully and what it implied about the people who had sent it. People who wanted to be understood as precise. People who had been patient. At 7:30 she got up without waking him and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the city come into its daytime self and tried to think clearly about what was happening and what was going to happen and where she stood inside it. Her phone showed a message from Elijah, sent late the previous evening. "Studio's available Tuesday if you need an alternate slot. Let me know." She looked at the message for a moment, then she put the phone face down and drank her coffee. "This is sign." The next 2 days moved in a specific rhythm. Tight, watched, almost normal on the surface, and not normal at all underneath. Hae-hyun was present in the penthouse in a way he hadn't been before. Not performing presence, actually there, working from the study with both doors open, appearing in the kitchen at times that corresponded to when she was in it, sitting in the living room in the evenings with a proximity that was new and deliberate. She was aware of the adjustment in him and aware of her own response to it, which was complicated by everything she had been carrying for 18 months, and couldn't simply put down because the circumstances had changed. Trust was not a switch. She knew that. He was figuring it out too, she thought, the particular difficulty of dismantling a behavior that had been structural for years, the way each small choice to be present required its own separate decision until eventually it might become habit. She didn't rush it. She didn't perform gratitude for it either. She let it be what it was and watched. On the second evening, they ate dinner at the same time, deliberately, at the kitchen island, which they had not done without a social occasion to necessitate it since the first month of the marriage. The food was simple. She had cooked, which she did when she needed something to do with her hands, a habit from her mother's kitchen that had survived everything else. He ate with an attention that wasn't polite. He asked how she'd made it. She told him. He asked a follow-up question. It was, on its face, an unremarkable dinner. She thought about it for an hour afterward. On the third morning, everything broke open. It started with Sue. He arrived at the penthouse at 8:15 with the expression of a man carrying something heavy and visible, the kind of expression Sue never permitted himself. In the years she had known him, he had been a surface of professional calm, smooth as a sealed room, and whatever he was feeling now had broken through that surface in a way that meant the thing he was carrying was too large to conceal. Jae-hyun met him at the elevator. She was in the kitchen, but the penthouse was open enough that she could hear the register of their voices, the specific rapidity of their Korean, without making out words. Then Jae-hyun's voice dropped to something she couldn't hear at all. Then silence. She set her cup on the counter. Jae-hyun appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face had gone to a place she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled neutral, not the working through it that she had learned to read. Something flatter. Something that happened when information was too serious for any of the usual processing to be adequate. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me standing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to the island and set a photograph on the counter in front of her, and she looked at it and felt the kitchen floor shift beneath her feet. It was Elijah. Not at the studio. Not in any context connected to her. Elijah Monroe seated at a table she didn't recognize, in a room she didn't recognize, across from a man whose face was partially obscured but whose profile was clear enough, and in Elijah's hands was a document. She couldn't read it from the photograph, couldn't see the specific content, but the angle of it and the deliberateness of Elijah's grip and the specific quality of attention between the two men at that table was unambiguous about what it was. A meeting, purposeful, private, between her piano teacher and someone in Jae-hyun's world. "When?" she said. Her voice was completely even. She didn't know how it was completely even. 7 weeks ago. 7 weeks. She ran the number backward. 7 weeks ago, she had been at her 8th lesson, had laughed in the studio for the first time, had driven home feeling lighter than she had in months. "Who is the other man?" she said. "His name is Min Seok Jin. He's a mid-level operator for the Seoul faction." Jae-hyun's voice was careful. Deliberately careful. She understood now. The care of a man who knew what he was saying and was watching what it would do. "He brokered the surveillance contract. He's also..." A pause. "The financial trail goes back further. Elijah Monroe's studio lease, the instrument purchase, the advertisement that came up in your search results." His jaw was rigid. It was constructed. The search results were manipulated to make his listing appear. His availability, his website, the specific language about beginners being welcome. It was built for you. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Elijah's hands on the document, the clean, careful hands she had watched move across piano keys for 4 months, the hands that had demonstrated fingering and corrected her position and existed in her mind as entirely benign, entirely separate from the world she was trying not to let consume everything. "He knew who I was," she said. "From the beginning. The whole time." "Yes." She set her hands flat on the counter. Something was moving through her that didn't have a clean name. It wasn't simply betrayal, though it was that. It wasn't simply humiliation, though it was that too. It was something more comprehensive and more structural. The sensation of a space she had believed was entirely hers, turning out to have been watched from the inside the entire time. The hour. Her hour. The one thing that had been only hers. "The recital," she said. "Yes. He put me in a room with other people for photographs." Jae-hyun said nothing, which was confirmation. She looked at the surface of the counter. The marble was cold under her hands. She thought about "there you are" and what it had cost her to hear those 3 words and what they had actually been. Not recognition, not warmth, not a person seeing her clearly, a professional telling her the performance was working. "Get out of my kitchen," she said. "Amara Chet, I need you to not be in the room with me right now." Her voice was still even. She was working very hard to keep it even. "Please." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that she didn't have the bandwidth to address. Then he left the kitchen. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the marble and breathed. In through the nose, slow, out through the mouth. She did this 6 times. On the 7th breath, something broke loose in her chest, and she bent forward over the counter and put her face in her hands, and made no sound at all, which was worse than if she had. She was in the kitchen for 20 minutes. When she came out, she had washed her face at the kitchen sink, and her eyes were clear, and her hands were steady, and she found Jae-hyun in the living room standing at the window, not working, not performing, just standing with his back to her and his hands at his sides. And she said his name. He turned. I have questions, she said. Yes. Was any of it real? The music, the teaching? She held his gaze. Or was the entire thing fabricated? We believe Monroe is a genuine musician. His background checks out, his conservatory training, his previous students. Those existed before any contact with the Soul faction. They recruited him approximately 9 months ago. His financial situation at the time made him... He stopped. Started again. Accessible. So he's real, and what he did to me is also real. Yes. And the teaching, the lessons. She pressed. Was he actually teaching me, or was it... He was teaching you. Jae-hyun's voice was careful. Everything that happened in that studio technically happened. The manipulation was the context around it. Getting you there. Keeping you comfortable. Generating the photographs. A pause. Generating the evidence of your attachment. My attachment, she repeated. To him. As an alternative... He stopped again. Say it. As an alternative loyalty. Something that could be used to suggest your relationship with him was something other than piano lessons. Something that could be... His jaw tightened. Leveraged. Against me. She understood it completely in that moment. Not just the mechanism of it, but the sophistication, the patience it had required, the long game of it, building her a room of her own and filling it with someone who appeared to be exactly what she needed and was watching her the entire time, building a record of her being happy in the presence of another man, building a story that could be extracted and used to damage what was already fragile between her and Jae-hyun. They knew we weren't... She gestured at the space between herself and Jae-hyun. They knew the state of things. Yes. That's how they knew it would work. Not just the photographs of where I was, the photographs of who I was with, and the implication of yes. She sat down on the couch. Just sat, which she needed to do. She looked at the coffee table, at the specific grain of the wood, and thought about how thoroughly she had been read by people who had never spoken to her. How did they know, she said, the state of things between us? Who told them? The silence that followed was different in quality from the other silences. She looked up. Jae-hyun's face had gone to the flat, controlled place again, and she recognized now that this was not the management of neutrality. This was the specific expression of a man containing something that was causing him pain. Who told them? She said again. We're still confirming. Jae-hyun, we have a strong lead. I'll know within... Who? Her voice came out sharp enough that he stopped. She stood back up. Who in your organization told people who want to hurt you that your marriage was a performance? Who watched us in this apartment and passed it to Seoul? He held her gaze. Someone I trusted, he said. Someone I've worked with for 7 years. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. 7 years. Someone in the inner architecture of everything Jae-hyun had built. Someone with access to the texture of their life. Someone who had watched 18 months of managed distance in one rinsed coffee cup and had reported it outward to people who could use it. Someone who had known before Seoul knew. Someone who had been in this building, possibly in this apartment, watching and calculating and feeding information into a machine designed to dismantle what was already barely holding together. Who? She said. He said a name. She knew the name. Not well. She had met this person twice. A man named Kim Dae-won, Jae-hyun's longest-serving lieutenant, a quiet man with an unremarkable face who had always existed in the background of the operational life she was never fully allowed to see. She had no strong impression of him. That was, she understood now, entirely the point. Why? She said. Ambition. Disagreement over the direction of certain operations. Jae-hyun's voice was very flat. He believed the organization needed different leadership. He believed creating a liability. His jaw worked. Creating a situation in which I was compromised by a personal exposure would give him leverage to move. He used me to move against you. Yes. He watched you keep distance from me for 18 months and decided it was the lever. Yes. She processed this. The full weight of it. Not just the betrayal of Jae-hyun, 7 years, trust, inner circle. But the specific calculation that had been made about her, the clear-eyed analysis of her loneliness and what it made her reachable for, the precision of the weapon they had built from the thing she had needed most. Where is he now? She said. In custody. My people have him. And Monroe? A pause. Not yet located. He didn't come to the studio this morning. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. So he knows the operation is blown. Yes. Which means whoever is running this above him knows too. Yes. Which means the timeline on whatever they were planning has accelerated. Jae-hyun looked at her with something in his expression that she didn't have a full category for. Something at the intersection of fear and, strangely, something that looked almost like the shock of being recognized. Yes, he said. Amara, I need you to listen to me very carefully about what happens now, because the situation as of this morning is... His phone went off. Not the operational tone. Something sharper. Something she had never heard before. He looked at the screen. Every remaining fraction of color left his face. He looked up at her and said, very quietly, They have Sue. The room felt like it tilted 2 degrees. Sue, who had been with Jae-hyun for 11 years, who ran his security, who was the closest thing in this world to someone Jae-hyun considered irreplaceable, who had been in this penthouse an hour ago with a heavy expression and had left again and was now, Where? She said. The message doesn't say where, it says, He stopped. His hand on the phone was not steady. For the first time since she had known him, Kang Jae-hyun's hand was not steady, and he knew she could see it and he didn't hide it. He read the message a second time. Then he set the phone on the coffee table face up so she could read it too, which told her something significant about how far they had moved in the last 12 hours. That his first instinct now was to show her, rather than manage her away from it. She read it. We have what belongs to you. You have 48 hours to step down and transfer operational authority to Kim Dae-won, or we begin returning pieces, starting with the ones he can live without. Below the text was a photograph of Sue. He was seated, wrists bound to the arms of a chair, a cut above his left eye still wet. His face was controlled the way trained men kept their faces controlled when they needed to give nothing away. But his eyes were open and clear and looking directly at the camera with an expression that communicated, with complete specificity, I am alive and I am thinking and do not do anything stupid. Amara looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Jae-hyun. 48 hours, she said. Yes. Kim Dae-won arranged his own extraction before Sue could secure him. Yes. So Dae-won is with them. Yes. His voice was a stripped wire. All the social architecture completely gone now. Nothing left but the operational mind, and underneath it something that was almost fear and was not going to be called that. He has been coordinating with the Seoul faction for at least 4 months. The surveillance on you, the Monroe operation, Sue's location. Dae-won fed all of it. She stood up. She didn't pace. Pacing was for people who needed to move to think, and she needed to be still to think. So she stood at the window with her arms crossed and looked at the city and thought fast and hard. They're not going to get what they want, she said. It wasn't a question. No. So the 48 hours is theater. It's a clock. They know I won't comply. The compliance demand is for Dae-won's people. Internal politics, showing his faction, he made the move. The real purpose of the 48 hours is, his jaw tightened, pressure, and documentation. Documentation of what? He was quiet for a moment. She turned from the window and looked at him. His hands were at his sides now, both of them, and the steadiness was back. But it was the steadiness of pure control rather than genuine calm, and she could see the difference. Documentation that I have a vulnerability, he said, that I can be moved, that the man who built his entire operation on never being personally reachable has something that reaches him. He held her gaze. They're not just taking Sue. They're publishing the fact that it worked, that I have something they can threaten. Me, she said, the existence of something that matters to me. He said it directly without softening it or managing its implications. Yes, she breathed through that, steadily. Then the problem isn't only getting Sue back. The problem is the message the method sends. Yes. Getting him back quietly doesn't solve it. No. Getting him back loudly. He stopped, started again. Getting him back in a way that redraws the line, that makes the cost of using that leverage so specific and so clear that no one tries it again. She looked at him for a moment. How? And there it was. The question she hadn't asked in 18 months. The question she was asking now, the exact nature of her finally being inside this rather than outside it. He registered it. She saw him register it. Something moved across his face that wasn't strategy and wasn't fear, just the specific gravity of being met by someone at the exact place where you actually are. I need to find them in the next 6 hours, he said. Before they move Sue and before they establish a position they can defend. Right now they believe they have 48 hours. That belief is the only advantage I have. How do you find them in 6 hours? Day one has a pattern. Properties he uses, people he trusts, a way of operating that I built and that I know better than anyone. He crossed to the desk and picked up his phone. I know where he'd go. I know 2 locations, but I need to move on both at once and He stopped. Short-handed, she said, because your security chief is in one of those locations. Yes. She uncrossed her arms. What do you need from me? He looked at her sharply. Amara, I'm not asking to go with you. I'm asking what you need. She held his gaze. I'm in this. You said you'd tell me things that affect me. This affects me. Tell me what you need. He held her gaze for a long beat. Then, I need you here. With 2 men I trust, in this apartment, with your phone on and the secure line open. If I go dark for more than 90 minutes, you use the emergency protocol. Sue briefed you on last year. The number, the word, the location. He paused. You remember it. She had been briefed on it as a formality, she had assumed. Sue, sitting across from her at the kitchen island with a sheet of paper she was supposed to memorize and destroy, his voice professional and slightly apologetic, explaining the steps you took if Jae-hyun went unreachable. She had memorized it and destroyed it and not thought about it again for 12 months. I remember it, she said. Something moved through his expression. He nodded once. Then he picked up his other phone and started making calls. He left 32 minutes later with 4 men she had never seen before and an absence of ceremony that was its own specific kind of violence. No hesitation in the doorway, no prolonged moment of connection, just a look from across the living room that lasted 2 full seconds and carried everything that wasn't being said. And then the elevator doors and the silence. She stood in the living room with the 2 men he'd left, quiet, armed, professionally neutral. And the secure line on the counter and the city outside and the specific quality of waiting that was nothing like the waiting she'd done for 18 months. That waiting had been passive, the waiting of someone who didn't know what she was waiting for. This was different. This was someone who knew the shape of what was at stake and was holding her nerve inside it. She was good at it, she discovered. Better than she might have expected. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen island with the secure line within arm's reach and the phone face up. And she thought about Sue in the photograph. The clarity of his eyes, the deliberate openness of his expression, communicating through a camera to whoever would see it that he was present and thinking. She thought about what that kind of composure cost. 41 minutes in, her regular phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it. The 2 men in the living room were immediately alert. She could feel the shift in their attention without turning around. She picked up. Hello, she said. Mrs. Kang? The voice was male, Korean-accented English, unhurried. I apologize for contacting you directly. This isn't the kind of call I prefer to make. Her blood went cold in a very precise and functional way. Not paralyzing cold, operational cold, the cold that sharpens rather than freezes. Who is this? Someone who has been watching your marriage with considerable interest for some time. I believe you're familiar with some of my recent work. Min Seok-jin. The name arrived without drama. The man from the photograph with Elijah. The mid-level operator who had brokered the surveillance. What do you want? She said. Your husband has some assumptions about where we are. I'd like to correct one of them before he acts on incorrect information and someone gets hurt unnecessarily. A pause. The 2 locations he identified, Dishong, he's right about one of them. His instinct about day one's patterns is accurate. He's wrong about which one. She held the phone very still against her ear. Her face was completely neutral. She was aware of the 2 men behind her, and she was aware that her face was the only thing they could read right now, and she was not going to show them anything that would escalate this moment before she understood it. Why would you tell me that? She said. Because the location he's wrong about has people in it who are going to react badly to his arrival. And because... A pause that had something measured in it. Because what I want is a specific outcome, and it doesn't require your husband to be harmed to achieve it. It only requires Dai-Wan to lose. Another pause. I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Kang. I'm a businessman who made a contract with someone who has since become inconvenient to me. She processed this at speed. Mid-level operator. Contracted by Dai-Wan's faction. Dai-Wan's faction losing served Min Seok-jin's interests if Dai-Wan had made promises he couldn't keep, if the operation failing meant Dai-Wan's debt landed somewhere specific, if there was an internal soul calculus she wasn't fully seeing. Which location? She said. The warehouse in Red Hook. That's where Mr. Su is being held. A pause. The other location, the one your husband thinks is primary, is a misdirection. Dai-Wan set it up. He anticipated your husband's read of his own patterns. And you're telling me this because I would like this to end with Dai-Wan gone, and your husband understanding that some people in my organization had no interest in this operation. I would like a conversation at some future point about what comes after. His voice was completely calm. And because, frankly, you are somewhat more trustworthy in this moment than your husband, who is operating on adrenaline and incomplete information. She sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Don't call this number again, she said. She hung up. She sat still for 2 seconds more. Then she picked up the secure line. Jae-hyun answered on the first ring. Talk, he said. His voice was compressed, clipped, the voice of a man in motion. Red Hook, she said. The warehouse, that's where Sue is. The other location is a setup. Dai-Wan anticipated your read. Silence. 2 seconds. 3. How do you know this? Min Seok-jin called my cell. The silence that followed was different. She could hear, or imagine she could hear, the recalibration happening in real time. He called you directly. Yes. He said the Red Hook location is real. He said the other one is a misdirection and that the people there will react badly to your arrival. She kept her voice even. I believe him. Not because I trust him, because the logic of why he'd give me accurate information holds. He wants Dai-Wan gone, and he wants a conversation with you after. Another silence. She heard voices in the background, movement, the specific compressed sounds of men coordinating in a confined space. You're sure, he said. I'm not sure of anything, she said. I'm giving you my read. You make the call. A breath. Then, Red Hook, give me 20 minutes. Jae-hyun. Her voice came out with something in it she didn't fully plan. Come back. A pause. Yes, he said. The line went dead. What? The next 23 minutes were the longest she had sat through since the night of their wedding. She didn't move from the kitchen island. The 2 men behind her had heard her side of both calls and were in their own private communication. She could see the small earpieces, the slight movements of acknowledgement, and she let them do whatever they were doing and focused on the kitchen counter and her own breathing and the specific discipline of not running every possible outcome through her head, because that was a loop with no useful exit. At minute 24, the secure line rang. She picked it up before the second ring. We have him. Jae-hyun's voice. Controlled but not compressed anymore. Something released in it. Sue is out. 2 injuries, neither critical. She put her hand flat on the counter and breathed. And Dai-Wan, she said. A pause. In custody. The other location. We redirected in time. Your information was correct. There were 4 men there expecting us. He paused. We didn't go in. Min Seok-jin's people. Some of them. His voice shifted register slightly. You handled that call correctly. I know, she said. Something that might have been a different kind of silence, not operational, something warmer than that. And then, I'll be home in an hour? She set the secure line down, looked at the counter, looked at her own hand on it, steady, which she noted with a slight surprised recognition. She got up and made the coffee she was going to need and waited in the way she had learned to wait, which was not passively, not performing patience, but simply present inside the hour until it ended. So, he came through the door at 11:47. She heard the elevator and came out of the kitchen and stopped when she saw him. He had blood on his left sleeve. Not his, she didn't think. But the question registered on her face before she could stop it, and he shook his head once, meaning, not mine. He looked like a man who had been running on pure intention for 6 hours and had arrived at the other side of it and was now processing what his body had actually been doing the whole time. There was a bruise forming along his right jaw. His shirt was torn at the collar. He looked at her from across the living room, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then she crossed the room and put her hand against his jaw, the unbruised side, carefully, and felt him exhale. The same exhale as 2 nights ago in the bedroom, but deeper. The exhale of someone who had been afraid and was no longer and hadn't let himself know how afraid until now. "Sit down," she said. "Amara, sit down. You're shaking." He looked down at his own hands. He was, in fact, shaking. The fine tremor of adrenaline leaving a body. The kind that hit trained men 20 minutes after the thing was over, rather than during. He sat on the couch. She got the first aid kit from the bathroom and came back and sat beside him and looked at the bruise on his jaw and the cut below it that was shallow but still seeping. She cleaned it without asking permission. He let her. His breathing was slowing down. She could track it, the intervals lengthening, the exhales getting fuller. "Sue," she said. "At the hospital, broken wrist. Concussion." His voice was getting back to something like its normal register. "He'll be fine." "And day 1, secured." He paused. "There will be a process. It will be handled." She didn't ask what the process was. She understood well enough. She pressed a bandage to the cut and held it and looked at the side of his face, at the bruise spreading under his eye, at the exhaustion and the remnants of fear, and underneath all of it, the particular expression of a man who had run toward the thing he was protecting and had gotten there. "You believed Min Seok-jin's information," he said. "I believe the logic of it. There's a difference." The logic held. "Yes." She smoothed the edge of the bandage. "I told you I understood your world." He turned his head and looked at her directly, and the look had something in it that she didn't have a full category for. Not gratitude exactly, not admiration exactly. Something that contained both and also contained the specific weight of a man realizing something about the person next to him that he should have known much earlier. "You could have panicked," he said. "Most people would have." "I don't panic," she said. I get very cold and very focused. It's not a virtue. It's just how I'm built." "It's a virtue," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the unguarded face she had seen for the first time 2 nights ago, and now it was completely unguarded. No management, no strategic distance, no performance of stability. Just him, the actual him, underneath all of it, the man who had been afraid of exactly this kind of proximity for his entire adult life, and who was sitting on his own couch with a bandage on his jaw and shaking hands, letting her see it. "Jae-hyun," she said. "I know," he said, quietly, like an answer to a question she hadn't fully asked. "This isn't over," she said. "Min Seok-jin still wants his conversation. The Seoul faction is going to respond to tonight. Daewon's people." "I know." He reached up and covered her hand with his, the hand she still had resting against the bandage. "I know all of that. And it will be handled, but differently than before." His hand over hers was warm and slightly unsteady, and completely deliberate. "Not with distance as the strategy. Distance—" He stopped, made himself say it. "Distance didn't protect you. It only isolated us both." She looked at their hands. "What does differently look like?" she said. "I don't know exactly yet." His thumb moved against her fingers. "But it starts with not making unilateral decisions about what you need. And it starts with—" He exhaled. "With this, whatever this is, not being managed." She looked at him for a long moment. The bruise on his jaw, the exhaustion, the realness of him, the unshielded, specific realness that she had needed to see for 18 months. "Elijah," she said, "I want to know what happens with him." Something tightened in Jae-hyun's face. "He'll be found." "I want to be told what you find." She held his gaze. "Not managed, told." "Yes." "He was my instructor for 4 months. Whatever he was doing," she pressed through it. "I need to understand what was real, for myself, not for any other reason." "I understand." "Do you?" "Yes." His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady on hers. I understand that this happened to you, that someone used the thing you built for yourself. His voice dropped. He stopped. The word didn't come easily. She could watch it not coming easily, the specific difficulty of a man who had never had much practice with this particular vocabulary. I'm sorry I wasn't there to prevent it. You couldn't have known. I should have. Jae-hyun. She said his name flatly. Not unkindly, but flatly. Don't make this about your failure to protect me. It's not. It's about people who were very clever and very patient and who knew exactly which door to use. She looked at him. The door they used was my loneliness. That's on both of us. The sentence sat in the room between them. He held it. He didn't look away, and he didn't deflect, and he didn't manage it into something more comfortable. He held it with the same directness she had used to deliver it. Yes, he said. So we fixed that, she said. We fixed the actual problem. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his hand over under hers and held it properly. Not the grazing touch of earlier, not the tentative press of 2 nights ago, but deliberately, with the full intention of a man who had decided, and his grip was warm and slightly rough from the evening and completely finally without reservation. Yes, he said again. Outside, the city continued its indifferent, luminous existence. Somewhere in Red Hook, Daewon was in a room from which he would not easily leave. Somewhere Elijah Monroe was running. Somewhere Min Seok-jin was waiting for a phone call that would not come tonight. The machinery of consequence was already turning, slow and sure, and it would not stop turning simply because 2 people had finally reached each other across 18 months of managed distance. But that was tomorrow. Tonight was this: his hand in hers, the bruise on his jaw, the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling glass, and somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the fear and the adrenaline leaving both their systems, something that had been present from the beginning, something that had survived every obstacle, including the ones they had built themselves, finally settling into its actual shape. Not performance, not arrangement, not the careful management of an image, but the real and specific weight of 2 days after the night in Red Hook, Soo came home from the hospital, not to his own apartment. Jae-hyun had his people move him to a recovery suite 2 floors below the penthouse, a decision made without discussion that Amara understood was as close to an apology as Jae-hyun was capable of making to a man who had taken a broken wrist and a concussion because his own organization had a leak. Soo arrived in the elevator with his left arm in a cast and a bruise covering the left side of his face in a gradient from purple at the cheekbone to a faded yellow-green near his jaw, and he looked at Jae-hyun and then at Amara and said, with the precise understatement of a man who had been doing this job for 11 years, I should have seen Daewon earlier. You weren't the only one, Jae-hyun said. Soo looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them that didn't require words and that Amara understood she was witnessing rather than participating in. The specific language of 2 people who had been through enough together that the important things happened in register she couldn't fully access. Then Soo looked at her and said, He told me what you did, with the call. I made a judgment, she said. It was correct. I know. She said it without arrogance, just as a statement of fact, and Soo looked at her with a slight recalibration in his expression, a small and deliberate upgrade in how he was categorizing her, and she recognized it and let it land without comment. He went to recover. She and Jae-hyun went upstairs and didn't talk about it because they didn't need to. Elijah Monroe was found on the 4th day, not by Jae-hyun's people, by a combination of Min Seok-jin's network and, improbably, a routine traffic stop in Newark that produced his name against an outstanding warrant for a financial judgment his studio had been avoiding for 2 years. The information came to Jae-hyun through a channel she didn't ask the details of, and he told her directly, the way he was telling her things now, not managed, not edited for her protection, just told. He asked her what she wanted to do with the information. She sat with the question for a full day. She walked through the penthouse and she sat at the kitchen window and she thought about 4 months of Thursday mornings and what they had meant to her and what they had actually been. And she thought about there you are and the particular cost of those 3 words landing the way they had when the person who said them had known who she was from the beginning. She thought about Dorothy, the 63-year-old woman who had talked to her about grandchildren for 20 minutes and who had been real. who had been genuinely there with no agenda, one actual human being in a room full of constructed context. On the second day, she told Jae-hyun, "I want to talk to him." He went very still. Amar, not to confront him, not for... She thought about how to say it accurately. I need to hear what was real from him directly. I need him to say it. For myself, not for any legal or operational purpose. Just for me. It's not safe. I'm not asking for unsafe. I'm asking for a conversation in a controlled setting with you 20 feet away if you need to be. She looked at him. This is mine. The thing they used against me. I get to decide how I close it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then, I'll arrange it. They brought Elijah to a room in a building in Midtown that had no signage and no character, and the specific neutrality of a space that was used for exactly this kind of meeting. He was not restrained. He was there by what Jae-hyun's people had made clear was a strong suggestion, and he had come, which told her something about his own calculation of what cooperation was worth at this point. He looked smaller than he did in the studio. That was the first thing she noticed. The studio had been his space, and in his space he had a quality of settled authority, the teacher in his element, the musician in his room. Here he was just a man in a gray chair who knew he had been caught and was working out what to do with that. She sat across from him. The table between them was plain wood, nothing on it. She had told Jae-hyun to wait outside, which had produced the most sustained silent argument she had ever conducted with him entirely through eye contact, ending with him standing outside the door with his arms crossed and his jaw set in a way that she understood was his version of compromise. She looked at Elijah for a moment. He looked back. He had the decency, she noted, not to open with an explanation. Was any of it real? She said. He held her gaze. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, the hands she had watched on keys for 4 months. The teaching was real, he said. Everything I showed you was true. The way I showed it to you, that was real. But the reason you were there wasn't. No. How much did they tell you about why they wanted you there? He was quiet for a moment. They told me you were the wife, that they needed someone close to you, that the job was to be present, teach legitimately, generate a record of proximity. He paused. They didn't tell me what they were going to do with it. Does that matter? The question sat in the air. He looked at it honestly, she thought. Didn't reach for a quick answer, let the weight of it be what it was. No, he said finally. It doesn't. You knew who I was. From the first lesson. Yes. You knew what world I was in. Yes. And you came back every Thursday anyway? Yes. His voice was quiet. Not ashamed exactly. The shame would have been easier, she thought. Something to push against. Just honest, which was harder. I needed the money. That was the whole calculation. I needed the money and I told myself it wouldn't, that it wasn't hurting you directly. He stopped. I was wrong about that. You were wrong about that, she agreed. He looked at the table. For what it's worth, and I know it's not worth much, you got better, really better. By month 3, you had genuine feel for the instrument. That was real. She held that for a moment, turned it over. I know, she said. I could feel it. She looked at him. That's actually the part that's hardest. He looked up. The music was mine, she said. The progress was mine. And you were the wrong person to share it with, but the sharing was real anyway. That's what they actually took. Not my safety, not my reputation. They took the 1 hour a week that belonged to me and put someone in it who was paid to be there. She held his gaze. Do you understand how that specific thing feels? He held her gaze for a long moment. Yes, he said. I think I do. She nodded. She stood up. She looked at him for one more moment. The whole of him, the real musician, and the man who had made a calculation, and the person sitting in a chair in Midtown who had enough self-awareness to not pretend any of it was more complicated than it was. Don't contact me, she said. Don't come back to New York. Whatever arrangement my husband's people have made with you, follow it precisely. She picked up her bag. You're a good teacher. Find something worth teaching for. She walked out. Jae-hyun was in the hallway exactly where she'd left him. He looked at her face and didn't ask how it went, which was the right call. He just fell into step beside her and they walked out of the building into the March afternoon, and he didn't ask until they were in the car and she had been quiet for 2 full minutes. Okay? He said. Yes, she said, and meant it. The Min Seok Jin conversation happened 9 days later. It was not what she had expected, which was her error for expecting anything. She had a model of what that conversation would look like. The cold formality of two sides deciding the terms of a new arrangement, and the model was not entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Min arrived at a restaurant in Koreatown, neutral ground, Gaehyun's choice, with one other man who waited at the bar and an expression that was the particular expression of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had learned not to perform anything for them. He was older than she'd imagined from his voice, mid-50s, compact, with the unhurried quality of a man whose patience was not a personality trait but a professional tool developed over decades. He looked at her when she came in with Jae-hyun, and he did the slight recalibration that Soo had done, the small upgrade in category. And he sat down and ordered tea and said to Jae-hyun, "Your wife made a correct call under significant pressure with incomplete information. That's worth noting." "I'm aware," Jae-hyun said. "I'm noting it because it's relevant to what I want to discuss." He looked at her directly. "Mrs. Kang, I want to be plain with you about what I am, because I think you prefer that." "I do," she said. "I'm an operator in a network that has frequently been in conflict with your husband's interests. That conflict was primarily driven by Daewon's faction and their arrangement with the Seoul leadership, both of which are no longer functional." He set his tea down. "The people I actually work for have interests that align more closely with stability than with the particular disruption Daewon was selling. Daewon told them your husband was controllable, that a personal vulnerability could be used to redirect his operations." He paused. "He was wrong. I told them he was wrong. They didn't listen to me. Now Daewon is gone, and I have a conversation I've been trying to have for 8 months. Jae-hyun said, "Which is?" "Align. Clear, specific, mutually understood." Min looked at him steadily. "Your operations, my operations. Where they overlap and where they don't. What belongs to you and what doesn't." He paused. "And an agreement that the people around you are not resources for anyone else to use. That the line there is absolute." "The line there has always been absolute," Jae-hyun said. His voice was even, but underneath it something that was not entirely in control. "I know," Min said. "I'm asking you to let me tell the people I work for that it has been confirmed, explicitly, with the weight of tonight's meeting behind it." He looked at Amara. "They needed to understand that you are not a vulnerability, that using you as a lever produced the specific and comprehensive result it produced." A slight pause. "That's actually the most useful thing that came out of this entire situation. It demonstrated something that words couldn't demonstrate." "That he can be moved," she said, "but not in the direction they expected." Min looked at her for a moment. "Precisely," he said. The conversation lasted another 40 minutes, most of which she listened to rather than participated in, tracking the specific architecture of what was being built between the two men. Not trust, nothing that simple. Something more functional and more honest than trust. The agreement of two people who understood each other's capacity for harm and had decided that the alternative to a line was worse than the line itself. When it was over, Min stood and looked at her one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "Monroe genuinely didn't know what the photographs were going to be used for. He knew it wasn't clean. He didn't know it was a weapon." "I know," she said. "It doesn't change what he did." "No," Min agreed, "but it changes what he is." He paused. "I'm told he's left the city." "Good," she said. Ichan, Kim Dae-won's process, as Jae-hyun had called it, concluded in the 3rd week of April. She didn't ask for details and wasn't given them. She knew he was gone. Gone in the way that people in Jae-hyun's world went when they had done what Dae-won had done. And she sat with knowing it and didn't try to resolve it into something cleaner than it was. This was the world. This was the world she had married into with open eyes, and this was one of its specific costs. The weight of a justice that didn't look like any courtroom she had ever seen, and that she could not pretend was clean. She didn't pretend. What she did was sit with Jae-hyun in the kitchen on the evening it was confirmed and put her hand on the table between them, not touching him, just there. And he looked at it for a moment and then covered it with his and they sat like that for a while without talking. He had known Day One for 7 years. He had trusted him with things that required trust. Real access, real information, the inner structure of what he had built. That Day One had made a calculation, had looked at Jae Hyun's marriage and seen architecture to dismantle rather than a person to be loyal to, had been watching and feeding information for months. That was its own specific kind of wound, separate from the operational damage, deeper than it. She didn't try to diminish it. She sat with her hand under his and let it be the thing it was. 7 years, she said. Yes. Did you see it? Parts of it, looking back. His voice was even but effortful. There were moments I edited out because the alternative interpretation was, I didn't want it to be true. That's human. In my world, it's a liability. It's still human. She looked at him. You're allowed to be wrong about someone you trusted. That's not a failure of your instincts. That's a failure of his character. He looked at their hands. He believed I had gone soft, he said, that the marriage had... He stopped. That whatever was happening with you had compromised my judgment. And he looked up at her. He was wrong about what it was, he said. He read softness. It wasn't softness. It was... He searched for the word. Restraint. The hardest restraint I've ever practiced, and he mistook the restraint for weakness. Because he'd never had to practice it himself, she said. Because he didn't understand what it cost. Jae Hyun held her gaze. Yes. She turned her hand over under his and held it properly. For the record, she said, I don't need you to be invulnerable. I never needed that. I just needed you to be present. He squeezed her hand. Just that. And it was, she thought, entirely enough. She went back to piano in May. Not to Elijah's studio. That space was gone, closed without ceremony, and she didn't try to resurrect it. She found a new teacher through Jae Hyun's assistant, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, who taught out of a studio in the West Village, and who had the specific impatience of someone who had been teaching for 30 years and had no tolerance for people who didn't take the instrument seriously. Amara liked her immediately. The first lesson with Patricia, she played through the piece she had performed at the recital. Imperfectly, with 2 hesitations she hadn't had before, the months of absence visible in her hands. Patricia listened with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, and when Amara finished, she said, You were taught adequately. You've been away, and you've lost some of what you had. We'll get it back. How long? 3 weeks if you practice. 6 if you don't. Patricia looked at her over her glasses. What happened to the previous teacher? He's no longer in the city. Patricia opened her notebook. Well, he left you with a reasonable foundation. We'll build on it. She looked up. Same time next week? Yes, Amara said. She drove home in the late afternoon light, feeling the specific quality of something that had been broken being set back in alignment, not restored to what it was before, aligned to something new, something that had the scar tissue of what had happened built into its structure and was not worse for it. She sat in the car in the building's underground garage for a moment after the driver stopped, not moving, just present. Then she got out and went upstairs. Jae Hyun was on the rooftop terrace when she came in. She found him there by the absence of him in the penthouse. She had learned to navigate his presence by how he displaced the air of the rooms, and when the rooms felt unoccupied, she looked outward. She took off her shoes in the front hall and padded through the apartment and pushed open the terrace door into the early May evening. He was leaning against the rail with a glass of something he wasn't drinking. Manhattan extended in every direction below them. The grid of it, the accumulation of light and structure, the particular quality of the city at dusk when the buildings were beginning to glow from the inside and the sky was still faintly blue at the horizon. She came and stood beside him. He moved his arm and she stepped inside it, her shoulder against his chest, his arm settling around her with the ease of something practiced, though it was still relatively new. They were learning the geometry of it. 2 people who had been careful for too long, discovering the ordinary territory of being close without agenda. How was it? He said. Good. She thought about Patricia's impatience and her 30 years and her exact description of Elijah as adequate. She's going to be better for me. Harder. Good. They stood watching the city. A helicopter crossed the sky in the middle distance. Below them, the traffic moved in its slow arterial rhythm. She thought about the view from the first morning she had stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched the rain. How far away the city had seemed then, how ornamental, a backdrop to a life she wasn't fully inside. It didn't feel like that now. It felt like what it was. Their city. Complicated, and theirs. Min Seok-jin's contact called, Jae-hyun said. About. The Seoul leadership has formally distanced themselves from the Daewon operation. Official position is that it was unauthorized. He paused. Which it partly was, and partly wasn't. But the official position creates a basis. For the line. Yes, she nodded slowly. Do you believe them? I believe they're being pragmatic, which is more durable than belief. He looked at the city. Pragmatic agreements hold as long as the calculus holds. The calculus favors stability right now. And when it doesn't, then we adjust. He said it without drama, as a simple fact about the nature of the world they were in. That's always been true. I've been adjusting my entire career. The difference now is, he paused. The difference is, I'm not adjusting alone. She turned her head and looked at his profile. The bruise on his jaw was faded to a yellowish shadow. He looked tired in the way he often looked now. Not the exhausted of emergency, but the settled tired of someone doing difficult work, the tiredness that came with rest rather than fighting against it. I enrolled in an international finance seminar, she said. Online, 3 months. He looked at her. When did you decide this? This week. Patricia reminded me that absence costs you. I've been absent from that part of myself for a while. She held his gaze. I'm not going back to a firm. I know the exposure issues, but I'm not going to stop being someone with her own work, her own thinking. He held her gaze. I wouldn't ask you to. I know. I'm telling you, not asking. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that this time made it all the way to an actual expression. Small, real, the smile of a man who was still learning how to let his face do the things it wanted to do. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. The sky continued its slow darkening at the edges. Somewhere in the city a siren traced its brief arc and faded. She turned back to the view and stood inside his arm and thought about the specific distance between who she had been on the morning she stood at these windows alone and who she was now, standing at them with the weight of his arm around her and the weight of everything that had happened between then and now, and found that the distance was neither as vast as it sometimes felt, nor as simple as she might have wished. It was exactly the distance of a real thing, no more and no less. There's something I haven't asked you, she said. Ask. The night of our wedding, what stopped you? She said it without heat, without accusation, just the question, plainly. I've had my theory for a long time. I want to know if I was right. He was quiet for a moment. The city below them. The early stars beginning at the far edge of the sky. You were right, he said. What I told you that night, that I was afraid of making you a target, that was true. But it wasn't the whole of it. He paused. The whole of it was that I'd never... Another pause. The specific difficulty of a man excavating something he had been keeping at depth for a long time. I had never been genuinely afraid of losing something before. Things I valued, yes. Things I'd built, but not this specific kind of afraid. Not the kind where the loss would be... He stopped. Personal, she said. Yes. He exhaled. I didn't know how to be in it. I knew how to build, how to protect, how to operate in the world as it is. I didn't know how to be present inside something that I could lose from the inside rather than the outside. He looked at her. I managed the distance as a way of telling myself I was in control of what it meant. That if it stayed at a certain proximity, I could... He stopped again. Survive losing it, she said. Yes. She looked at his face. And now... He held her gaze directly, without the usual interval of management. Now I know I can't, he said. And I've decided that's not a reason to stand back. It's the reason to... He reached up and touched her jaw the way he had in the bedroom that first night. Deliberate, the full intention of it, his palm warm and steady against her face. To be here. She covered his hand with hers, held it. That's all I ever needed to hear, she said. He pressed his forehead to her temple. They stood like that on the rooftop, with the city spreading out in every direction below them, the lights coming fully alive now as the sky finished darkening, Manhattan in its nighttime self, indifferent and magnificent, the whole complicated, beautiful structure of a world that had never been safe and had never been simple and had never been anything other than exactly what it was. His arm was around her, her head rested against him. Neither of them were performing anything. He had spent his entire life learning how to not need anyone. She had spent 18 months learning how to not need him. Both of them had been wrong about what that kind of discipline cost, and neither of them were doing it anymore. What they were doing instead was harder and more specific and less clean and entirely real. And real was the only thing that had ever actually been worth protecting. Below them, the city went on doing what cities do, surviving, shifting, containing in its grid all the damage and the repair and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of people finding each other and holding on. In a hospital 2 floors below, Sue's wrist was healing. Somewhere in the city, Min Seok-jin's pragmatic calculations were holding their shape. Somewhere, the music she was learning continued existing in her hands, waiting for Tuesday, waiting for Patricia's impatience and 30 years of knowing how to rebuild what absence had worn down. The threats were not gone. They had never been and would not be. The world they were in did not offer that. What it offered was exactly what was on this rooftop. 2 people who had stopped pretending that distance was the same as safety, who had learned at significant cost that the thing you refused to admit you had was the thing that could be used against you, and who had decided, not naively, not without full knowledge of what the decision meant, to stop refusing. She turned her face up slightly, and he turned his down, and they stood together in the exact place where everything had been decided, looking at the city they lived in, which was not safe and not simple, and was entirely theirs. Nothing was resolved in the way that easy resolutions worked. Everything was resolved in the only way that real things resolved, by being met, directly, with both hands, and held. The city glowed. His arm was around her. She breathed. That was all. That was enough. That was everything.